Thank you for joining today's USC, US-China Institute webcast. We are so fortunate to have you with us and to have with us the author of a wonderful new book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Dexter Roberts, who lived in Beijing, lived and worked throughout China for more than 2 decades, gathering information for Bloomberg Businessweek, where he worked, but also learning about the real engine behind China's economic rise. And he's with us today, coming to us today from Montana and participating in our presentation. I want to ask a couple of things. First of all, if you would like to raise a question, what you need to do is to use the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. So just move your cursor or your finger down to that space and click on the Q&A button, type in your question, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll draw upon your questions and others to have a conversation with Dexter Roberts. And so please do not hesitate to raise those questions. This webcast, of course, is coming from the USC US-China Institute, and many of you probably heard about it via our newsletter. If you are not a subscriber, we certainly want you to subscribe. All you need to do is go to china.usc.edu and click on the subscribe button. You can see that we've put up a poll if you'd like to let us know if you're a subscriber. And I also want to let the people on Facebook who are watching this live know that they're welcome to participate too by submitting questions either via Facebook or directly to us at uschina@usc.edu. That's our email address. We are so happy to have Dexter Roberts with us today. And this book is really unusual. It takes a look at the rise of China, but through the lives and experiences of the people who made it possible. So Dexter, who goes by Tiff, Tiff is a business reporter, was a business reporter for a couple of decades. He could have written a book about the amazing tech economy in China, about the clever and creative entrepreneurs who have done so well to build massive businesses in China. He could have been looking at the successes, the challenges of foreign businesses in China. But instead, he took us into the real engine. He looks at the institutions and the people that produced today's China. And he looks at a really neglected part of the story. And so through his attention to institutions, such as the hukou household registration system, he explores how China, today's China, was built. It's a remarkable book. It samples history going back to the Han Dynasty and the Wangmang interregnum through revolts, but it focuses very much on the lives and experiences of ordinary people. Reading this book, you get a sense of what it is like to live and work in China. You get a sense of the choices that are available to people. Many of these choices really hard. So Tiff's presentation is about 34 minutes long. And so we're going to go ahead and share that with you now. And then at the conclusion, he'll be with us live to take your questions. So please, again, if you'd like to submit a question, use the Q&A button on the Zoom web interface, or contribute your question via Facebook or via email at uschina@usc.edu. Thanks everybody for joining us. You're going to be richly rewarded. This is a fantastic book. You'll get to meet the author in just a little bit.
Welcome to today's book talk on the myth of Chinese capitalism, the worker, the factory, and the future of the world. I'd like to start today by talking about how I came about to do this book. And to do so, I need to go all the way back to the year 2000. I'd been a reporter for about 5 years in China for Businessweek magazine. And in that year, I worked on 2 cover stories that at the time took me down to, I think that was the first time I traveled to both Guangdong province, where Dongguan is, and the factory to the world, and to Guizhou province. I'd been to Dongguan before that, but I had not been, I believe, to Guizhou before then. So the first cover story I was working on, you can see here, it was called China's Wealth Gap, and published in May of that year. And it was a story looking at the growing wealth gap between China's increasingly developed east and its still impoverished interior, where most of China's migrants hail from. And that was back when Jiang Zemin had launched, not long before that, the Great Western Development Plan, or Shibu Kaifa. And the goal was to try to deal with this inequality that had only grown larger under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, which had started some years before, since in 1978. The second cover story I worked on was called The Great Migration, and as the title indicates, it was about the migration of China's rural people to come and start working in the factories, mainly along China's coast, and many in Guangdong province. And that story came out later in the year, in December. And for both of those stories, as I said, I did travel to Guizhou. For this second story, I was able to meet a group of people who I later came to know very well and did more reporting on. And eventually now they are featured in my book. And that is the Mo's, which are all from a relatively remote village in the southeastern part of Guizhou. They happen to belong to the Bui minority. And that particular village, Binghua, or Binghuacun for Binghua village, was where the Mo's hailed from, and that I went and I visited that year for the first time, again in mid 2000. So my book, I try to tell through sort of the story of China's economic development over the last couple decades, and try to look to where it's going in the future through the Mo's, who I profile, and also through 2 places, Guangdong and particularly Dongguan, which again I visited in 2000, often known as export capital of the world, and Guizhou, which is a source of many of the migrant workers that have gone to work in Chinese factories, construction sites, and now increasingly in the service industry. On the left side of the slide, we have an auto factory. That's actually in Guangzhou, not in Dongguan, north of Dongguan. And that's between shifts, so you can see the workers are on their way, I believe, to take a break. And on the right is the village of Binghuacun, a more recent picture that I took on one of my many visits in the last 5-6 years. So I'd start with a few pictures here. These next few pictures are credit to Greg Girard, a wonderful photographer who actually was along on both those stories back in 2000, and whose pictures as well are included in my book. This is a factory, an electronics factory, which is where the Mo's that I met that summer when I traveled there to Dongguan worked, and was a Taiwanese-owned factory, like many of the factories in Dongguan, and a place where they were starting to save up money to send back to their village in Binghuacun. This is Mo Rubo. Mo Rubo is someone who I got to know very well, and I write about in my book, and a fascinating individual. At the time when I met him in 2000, he was quite young. I think he was maybe 20 years old. He'd already spent maybe 5 years traveling the country and working in different factories from near Shanghai, Ningbo, all around Guangdong. And at that point, when I met him in 2000, as you can see, he was working as a welder in this Taiwanese-owned factory. And there's Mo Rubo again, standing with his girlfriend at the time, now his wife, who I also met during that visit in 2000. This is another shot from the year 2000 when we traveled back to their village, and I met some of those same Mo's that I had met a few months earlier in the city of Dongguan. This is Mo Meichuan on the woman in the red jacket. She was back trying to get a new household permit issued, an identity card as well, because hers had, I think her identity card had actually had expired, and it was very, very risky for them to have expired ID cards. They could get picked up by the police and thrown into these holding cells, what they called black jails, if they didn't have the proper papers. So I saw her on that trip back to Binghuacun. And here's a picture of elderly women and children outside some of the traditional houses there in Binghuacun, also taken by Greg Girard on that trip back in 2000. So when I visited back then, one of the things that everyone wanted to talk to me about, and they were actually aware about, was China's imminent entry to the World Trade Organization. That was going to happen just a year plus later at the end of 2001. And even in Binghuacun, people were talking about it. The party secretary that I met, Mo Wenke, was very interested in the idea of, first of all, he wanted to talk to me because he was hopeful that the attention on their village would potentially bring investors, either Chinese investors or overseas investors, American investors. And he wanted to make get investment into a processing plant that would help them move up the value-added chain and process the chili peppers and the tomatoes and the other kinds of vegetables that they grew there in the village. China's entry to the World Trade Organization, transformed the country in many ways. As I mentioned in this slide, foreign investment in China jumped from $47 billion in 2001, the year that China entered the WTO, and actually grew to $124 billion just a decade later. It also accelerated this movement of Chinese migrants from the countryside to the factories to find work. Shortly after that, we did this cover story, a number of years after that, I think maybe it was 2005, about what manufacturers around the world were starting to refer to as the China price. And as we said, the three scariest words in U.S. industry. What was the China price? It was the ability of factories inside China to undercut manufacturers everywhere else in the world and offer similar products, hopefully at similar quality, for much, much cheaper. And that was built more than anything else on cheap migrant wages. So very, very low labor wages. And these migrants, of course, were the ones being paid these very, very low labor wages. A number of years later, we start to see the issue of sweatshops in China really take off. And at the same time that the world is starting to pay attention to this, and universities in the U.S. and other countries, students actually start to focus on this, make it an issue, start to pressure companies like Nike to make sure that their supplier factories are treating their workers well. At the same time in China, wages actually start to go up. And this is a demographic shift, in part because of the one-child policy and the fact that the number of migrants coming from the countryside actually starts to slow to a degree. And fast forward a few more years, 2010, one of the biggest issues in manufacturing we hear about is this tragedy of worker suicides at Apple supplier Foxconn. This rather grim picture that I took in 2010 shows the suicide nets that they put up at the below the windows of dormitories to try to catch any worker that might try to kill themselves. And at this point, it became very clear that that factories needed to do something in response to issues like this, and in response to growing wages. And this was the point, somewhat ironically, that Foxconn, they did try to improve worker conditions, but they also started to push heavily for the automation of their factories after these tragic deaths from workers, again in 2010. So the one-child policy, I started in probably about 6 or 7 years ago. I'd been covering manufacturing in China very closely. I had done those stories on the Mo's, on the income gap in the West, between the East and the West, on the migrant workers, and actually in the back of my mind started thinking someday that maybe I should try to do a book out of this. I was even an editor at the time when I did those covers, and particularly the Great Migration cover, actually said to me, "This is a fascinating story. You should think about turning back to this in a book form someday." So I had this idea in my head. Then about 2005, I started working on stories on some of what I call the legacy policies in China today. And what do I mean by legacy policies? I mean policies that originated or were started back in the Mao Zedong era, but still continued well into the reform era under Deng Xiaoping. And one of these, of course, was the one-child policy. And when I started writing about it, 2000, I can't remember the exact year, 2012, maybe a bit later. Of course, it was still going strong. And at that point, it had started to have an impact on China, most notably the shrinking workforce and an aging population. Another key legacy policy, and actually the one that I probably focus on more than any other in my book, is the household registration, or the hukou policy. This policy, as some of you no doubt know, dates way back in China's history. Some people see it as centuries old, and indeed there was something like a household registration system going back centuries. But it really became important to modern China, arguably in the 50s. And that was when Mao Zedong turned and looked at what Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union, and as he often did. And in this case, looked and saw this policy called, I think, the Propiska policy, which was an internal passport in the Soviet Union, and decided that it was something that should be implemented in China as well. So the hukou policy was implemented then, and at that time was mainly used as a means to ensure that there was there were people in rural China that were then on communes that were producing low-cost food and low-cost vegetables and grains that then could help support the cities and the industrialization of China. So the hukou policy continued well into the reform era, is still alive and well today, and is significant today because, most importantly, it ties the social welfare benefits of people to the place where they were born or where their parents were born. And so that means effectively for the migrant workers of China, the household registration of the hukou has become this real obstacle to them living full lives. And what does it do? It basically means that they cannot get access to health care like their urban counterparts in the cities at affordable rates. It also means that their children are unable to go to the good city schools, and often instead have to go to schools in the countryside that are typically of far inferior quality. It also affects where they can get their pensions if they're part of a pension program. Another policy that I look at a lot in the book is the dual land system, and the dual land system arose out of the household responsibility system to a degree, which was started way back in 1981. That was when they dismantled the communes and decided to allow farmers to decide what they could what to plant and at what rates they could sell it at market rates. And so that was a great benefit for the farmers, and led to a surge in agricultural productivity, and also led to much higher incomes for rural Chinese. But what did not change, and is still the truth today, or still very much alive today, is this distinction between rural and urban land. And some people call that the dual land system. And that is like the hukou policy, is a legacy policy that holds back rural Chinese and migrants today. And basically it means that it's very difficult for migrant workers, who typically do have a plot of land back in the countryside, as well as their relatives back in the countryside there who are still farming the land, to actually monetize the land or rent it or sell it at a market rate. And I should say actually that while that's true in the countryside, that hasn't been true at all in the cities, where, as we've all seen, there's been an explosion of wealth based on urban people renting or mainly buying and selling apartments. And has a lot to do with a very serious problem with a wealth gap in China today. So as I started to examine these policies, these legacy policies, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I first of all looked at them as really a human rights issue. So these are policies that ensure that a very large proportion of Chinese people, if you look at it, the total numbers, there's something like 300 million migrant workers. If you add in their country cousins or their relatives in the countryside, we're talking 500, 600 million people. So we're talking, a number significantly larger than the population of the U.S. Also, a number that gets close to half of the people in China. And that other China of migrants and rural people, because of these legacy policies, are really treated as second-class citizens. Why do I call it a human rights issue? One example here, the fact that because of the hukou policy, most migrant workers are unable to put their children into urban schools, means that they typically will leave those kids behind. They'll leave them back in the villages, often with their elderly parents, or increasingly now they'll put them in these very impersonal, large, new boarding schools that the Chinese government has spent a lot of money building out there. So the numbers, there's different numbers you hear, but according to some estimates, there's 61 million youth from rural China, children of migrant workers, who grow up separated from their parents, maybe only see them once a year during the Chinese or the Lunar New Year. This is a picture. This is me on the left. I'm here with Mo Rubo in the center. The young man we saw a picture of earlier as a welder, and also walking on the streets with his girlfriend. This is his wife, the same woman we saw in the earlier slide, and their little girl. I think this picture is about maybe 3 years old. And at this point, his daughter I think she was 5, and he was struggling with the question of what to do for her school because of the hukou policy. And he's one of those migrants who's tried to stay in the cities. It hasn't been easy. He hasn't gone back to his village, and he's a small entrepreneur. He has a clothing apparel company that he runs the business. The two employees are him and his wife, and they source athletic apparel, and they have their own brand, and they try to sell it. It's very difficult, and they run it out of their own apartment in a suburb of Dongguan. But during this visit several years ago, he was struggling with what to do about his daughter's education. She was coming up on the age when she needed to start first grade, and he was adamant about not wanting her to be left behind. He didn't want to send her back to live apart from him and his wife, and so was looking at options of these private schools that cater to migrant workers in the cities, which are typically of low quality and actually not very cheap. Another human rights issue related to the hukou policy is what they call empty nest villages. And this is a phenomenon where the migrants leave. As I mentioned, they often have to leave their children back in the countryside because they can't put them into school in the cities. And they can't usually take their elderly parents with them to the cities because their elderly parents often can't get access to healthcare there. So some alarming statistics here: 80 million elderly, or 60% of all the country's senior citizens, live outside cities now and far from better healthcare facilities. 1/5 of rural elderly have incomes that fall below the poverty line. So this is also in part a function of the hukou policy. And here's another a more recent shot of Binghuacun, the village, which has been an empty nest village for a number of years now, although that may change with migrants starting to come back and trying to start their own businesses. So why not reform these legacy policies, which is a question I return to in my book, towards the end of my book, after looking at the costs of these policies. First of all, the leadership of China knows that they need to reform these policies. As I argue in the book, I believe they're facing the biggest economic transition in decades, the biggest since Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening in the 78, 79, which launched this tremendous surge of growth and eventually led to China becoming factory to the world. So this has been the model in the past. It doesn't work anymore. Workers are no longer cheap in China, in part because of the one-child policy, but also these larger demographic shifts. Manufacturing workers in China now are more expensive than in Malaysia or in Mexico. There's been a problem with pollution, of course. Many of these factories have been polluting. China now has terrible pollution. We all know about it. The world knows about it. And they realize that they can't continue with that. The factory to the world model also has created wasteful energy policies. It's been too energy consuming, something else they're trying to change. And also it's related to the terrible problem they have with debt buildup, which by many estimates now, debt in China amounts to more than 300% of GDP, which is a high level that in other countries has proved destabilizing. So they know they can't rely on this factory to the world model anymore. They have a plan. Part of it is encompassed in their Made in China 2025 strategic plan, which is about modernizing their industries and their manufacturing, pushing factory automation. So that's one big core part of what they're trying to do. But more broadly speaking, they are trying to move to a much more consumption or domestic consumption driven economy, much less reliant on exporting to the world. The 2-year trade war with the U.S. and the COVID-19 outbreak has also shown the risks of being too reliant on the rest of the world for economic growth. So they want to shift to a much more domestic consumption driven and a much more service industry driven economy. But the reality is, and they know this again, that they cannot get there as long as some half the population are treated as second-class citizens. The household registration policy, the hukou policy, amongst other things, makes it very hard for migrant workers to have real spending power. So their ability to join the middle class is restricted by the fact that they have to worry about healthcare and education for their families to a very, very large degree. They have to spend much time on that. It causes something that economists call precautionary savings, and makes it difficult for them to actually have high consumption levels. Excuse me. So back one slide there. So China knows that it has to move beyond these policies. Instead, what it's really focused on has been infrastructure build out. This is a picture from Guizhou. If you go back and recent trips there, it's been transformed. There's roads been put in, bridges, high-speed rail. But they have not made much progress on moving beyond these legacy policies. So back in 2013, I indicated on the earlier slide here, at the third plenum, there was sweeping promises made by the party to move and start to reform both the hukou policy and the dual land policy, and eventually do away with them altogether. And unfortunately, if you look at what's happened in the years since then, now 7 years, and by the way, we have new promises to reform these two legacy policies again in the last week or so, and I'm hoping that that this time they actually move through with implementation. But they have made very little progress in either reforming the dual land policy or the hukou policy. As I mentioned earlier, the reason to reform the dual land policy is in order to actually start to reverse this potentially destabilizing wealth gap, and also allow the rural people and the migrants to monetize the land and therefore have some money to become part of this domestic consumption economy that China wants to build. So why haven't they done that? There's a few. It's pretty obvious actually when you look at it, because there are some pretty substantial obstacles to reforming these policies. Starting with the hukou policy, one big issue is the fact that localities, cities in China, view the cost of trying to integrate migrants and their families into the healthcare systems, into the schools, as exorbitant. They're afraid that it's going to cost too much. And there are others that actually say, no, it shouldn't cost so much. If migrants are hardworking, if they became tax-paying residents in the cities, they actually would pay much of the cost of the new social welfare demands that they would require. But the fact of the matter is, many cities believe that it would be too expensive to try to integrate them in. Another big obstacle, frankly, are the urban residents themselves, who have become very used to having the cities to themselves. And whereas they rely to a great degree on the migrant workers, sometimes they don't realize how much they do, whether it's in the factories, working in restaurants, motorcycle couriers today, delivering food to their doors, or cleaners cleaning the office buildings or their apartments. They don't seem to always appreciate these migrant workers. And when the Chinese government in recent years has actually tried to do the right thing, for example, by allowing more migrant children into the schools, we've actually seen protests by urban residents who have the urban hukou, whose attitude is basically, it's hard enough to get my kid into a good school already. The last thing I want to do is have him compete with a whole bunch of migrant kids as well. So they honestly, or frankly, are a real obstacle as well to bringing the migrant workers, integrating them more fully into the cities. Big obstacle to reforming the dual land system is the fact that local governments in China are excessively reliant on land sales themselves. And so, whereas the rural residents and the migrant workers who still have land in the countryside are unable to sell their land at market rates, that's not the case for local officials. They basically are able to reclassify the land from agricultural use to commercial or residential, and sell it on, or build themselves factories there, or commercial real estate or residential real estate, and make great profits from selling that. So local governments are tremendously reliant on land revenues themselves. If China is going to make it a fairer system and allow the migrants and the rural people to instead benefit more from land sales, they're going to have to find new sources of revenue for local governments. So that is another big obstacle as well. As I mentioned earlier, this is some of the very impressive infrastructure that's been put into Western China in places like Guizhou. This is Guizhou. Here's another shot. It's a beautiful countryside. And so the infrastructure has been built but the lack of progress on reforming these legacy policies, arguably a much more important reform, I would say, and a much more important move that the government could do, there has been very little progress. Migrants have started going back to the countryside more and more. There's fewer and fewer jobs in the city, something I write about in my book in a chapter called Returning Home. China's push to automate its factories in some cases is actually accelerating this trend where jobs are disappearing in the factories. And many of the cities, as I said, are not very welcoming to the migrants. So here on the right, we have a gentleman, you can't see his face. His name is Myhrachun. He's another person I write about in the book, someone I met again in 2000. He's done fairly well. He's been a businessman. He lives in a prefectural capital of Libo, which is where Binghuacun is located, or nearby where Binghuacun is located. And he has big plans to try to set up a tourism operation in Binghuacun. And that's actually something the government has been supporting at the provincial level. They see Guizhou with its beautiful scenery, with its relatively little manufacturing or pollution, with its good food, and also with a very interesting people, very many different minority groups there, as a good place to develop for tourism, and particularly ecotourism. And so Myhrachun has been hopeful that he could eventually start a tourism operation and run a hotel out of Binghuacun. He's not made much progress on it, and it's unclear whether or not that can be a success. But that's one of the hopeful things I look at in my book, that this possibility of the migrants reinventing themselves as they leave their jobs in the cities. In many cases, they're not welcome there anymore, and actually becoming entrepreneurs in the countryside, in back in the provinces like Guizhou. The gentleman in this picture, Mo Wenke, is the former Binghuacun party secretary. I was back in the last 5 years, and there was a big meal there. He was back. He's no longer the party secretary, but here he is. He's the one who actually wanted to start the processing factory. The processing factory never came, unfortunately. Binghuacun today is still little changed despite China's entry into the WTO. But there is this potential hope for the future as some of the migrants start to return. Myhrachun, who was looking at the fish, buying fish in the last picture, you can just barely see his face on the far right there, and his arm reaching into the tofu in the wok-like bowl there. So I think I'd like to stop here and open it up to questions, which probably will be the far more interesting part of today's book talk.
Dexter, Tiff, thank you so much for this presentation. And let me ask, Dexter, go ahead and turn your camera on, and also then we'll be able to continue. So Tiff has written this wonderful book taking us to Guizhou, to Guangdong, all throughout many parts of China to explore these various stories. Many of you know his writing from decades writing for Businessweek. He was educated at Stanford and at Columbia and lived in China for a couple of decades. And you see that time put to very good use in this book. So first of all, Tiff, thank you and welcome virtually to USC.
Thank you, Clay. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Now, we're delighted to have you here, and we are collecting questions. So people who are on Zoom, if you could go ahead and use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, just click on that and go ahead and type your question in, and in just a minute, we'll start asking those questions. I wanted to begin, if I could, Tiff, by focusing where you focus on the hukou system and this land ownership system. But first, I have another question. You say there's a myth of Chinese capitalism. But your book actually illuminates all kinds of myths about present day China. But why don't you just go ahead, if you could, and summarize what you believe the myth of Chinese capitalism to be?
Yeah, well, good question. So broadly speaking, the myth that I talk about, the myth of Chinese capitalism, means that the reforms, the very real reforms that we've seen over the last few decades, or last 4 decades, and that powered so much growth and raised income levels across the country, is continuing. And I don't think that's true. It's particularly not been true in my mind since the party secretary and President Xi Jinping took over 2012, 2013. So that's sort of my first myth, that China is going to continue upon this reform course. Another myth I look at is that the Chinese middle class will just keep growing in leaps and bounds. And it's very large already, according to, depending on what estimates you look at, it's 300 million strong. So the middle class has grown tremendously in the years until today. But another key myth in my book is that middle class can continue to grow even as they maintain these restrictive policies, these legacy policies that keep migrants and people in the countryside in effect as second-class citizens. And then just quickly, the last myth I would say is that this idea that China will continue to be such a driver of global growth and also growth for markets for multinationals. And it's been very important, obviously, for years now for countries and companies around the world. But I argue that is no longer going to be true to the extent, even close to the extent that it has been previously.
Now, that's terrific. Thank you for that summary. And essentially, you're warning us. And what you're warning about, of course, Chinese leaders are really worried about. And you identify several policies that they are adjusting or promising to adjust, or promising to carry out reforms long promised, those sorts of things. You document this magnificently in the book and in your presentation. But let's go to that original sin in some ways, the hukou system. And you explain why it was put in place. And many Chinese, when you meet them today, after, they say, well, the hukou system doesn't matter that much. And these, of course, are mainly people who have first-tier hukou, people who already have the right to live in the city, enjoy the educational benefits, the access to healthcare, and all of those sorts of things. But your book shows how real and how limiting the hukou system is. It's wonderfully detailed in that way. And in your presentation just now, you said that one of the impediments to changing it comes from local officials. And they're saying it would just cost too much. And in the book, you say, one minister of finance put the estimate at something like 80,000 yuan per person if you were to make all of the people with rural hukou status, rural household registration, instant urbanites. And then you take us to Chongqing and you show other places where this is going. How interconnected is the hukou problem to this other big problem that you identify? The question of who owns the land, who controls the land?
Yeah, well, I should note, and I guess I mentioned in the presentation briefly, there's been a new announcement just in the last week about a high-level announcement about plans to further reform hukou and also the land system. And I hope it's for real. I think it's way, way overdue. I'm not too hopeful because of what we've seen in the past after previous announcements similar to this one. But the two policies, I think, are very related. And one big issue that they see is first on reforming the dual land system, they have a real fear, and the government officials have a fear, and this is a fair one, I think, that locals in the countryside might be taken advantage of, and they might sell their land to unscrupulous businessmen from the cities who would make off like bandits, and you suddenly would have a very large problem with landless farmers. How does this connect to the hukou? Well, of course, the hukou in part is aimed at trying to ensure that those people, landless or not, stay back in the villages, and they can fall back on this land that they have. So this has been a real fear, and frankly, it's also been a justification for the government in giving this large group of Chinese people, for example, much lower pensions. They've had extremely low. They finally rolled. They didn't used to have a pension at all for rural Chinese. And the rationale was, well, they can always fall back on their land and grow a little crop, and so they don't need that pension. Now they do have a pension, but it's very low. And again, it's because they supposedly have this land that they can fall back on. So the two are very tightly entwined. I mean, if the fear is that you reform the dual land policy too quickly, and you reform the hukou policy, and you will start to have these huge impoverished populations of people on the outskirts of the cities. And of course, that's a reality in many places around the world. So you can understand the fear that they have there.
Yeah, this of course would be as big a change as breaking up the communes and letting people keep the profits, from their land or leave the land to find a better future. Now, one of the stunning statistics, and this book has so much research to it, interviews, but also a lot of really solid research. One of the numbers that you bring is the notion that 300 million people who have, who ideally would have access to some land, have lost their land rights. By leaving the village, not going back, not maintaining that claim. And so even if land were to be distributed, presumably these folks would be left out.
Yeah, I think that's a real issue. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why migrants have felt tied back to the village is many of the local villages have had policies where if the migrants don't till the land for a certain number of years, they do periodic redistricting, if you will, of how much land goes to everyone in the village. If the migrant hasn't come back, they will be simply cut out of that. Their little share will be given to someone else, or maybe often will go to some development that the local officials are carrying out. So it is an issue already, this landlessness. And again, as I said earlier, I think it is a fear that the government has when they look at trying to reform the land system. I do think that they're making a big mistake. As I said earlier, they can build all the bridges and roads and rail that they want to do, but actually not giving these people the opportunity to profit from the little bit of property that they at least sit on, which is, in the countryside, it's technically collectively owned, but not giving them the right to sort of monetize or make money off that is a huge problem. And so it's also, frankly, a problem for China's agricultural self-sufficiency, which they're concerned about often because no one wants to invest improvements into the land because they don't know how long they'll hold it, and the plots are small, and so on.
That's one of the interesting parts of the book, where you are talking to Chinese agricultural officials, and they're going out to buy land, to buy property outside of China, to acquire things, to become multinational agribusinesses. And you're also talking to representatives from American agribusiness about these kinds of subjects. I wanted to ask, and I'm only going to ask one or two more questions, and then we're going to go to the questions that are coming in. We have quite a few. Please use that Q&A button to contribute your question to our discussion. One of the fascinating aspects of this book is where you talk about the rising labor consciousness. And in part, this is the government offering legal reforms and things like that, but also it's NGOs, it's labor lawyers, as well as general human rights lawyers. And that's a stream that runs through this book. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how the situation is perhaps worse today than it was just a few years ago.
Yeah, well, there was this, it really started with government policy, with the creation of the labor law, a new labor law, and then a labor contract law. And those laws, by the way, are they provide quite strong protections for workers. And at the time, the officials that were coming up with the labor law were actually looking at German labor law, European labor law, which was, provides quite strong protections for the different for workers. And so they put those laws in place. And at the time, they told workers and they told local officials these laws should be implemented and they should be obeyed. And what happened was we saw the beginning of civil society, of labor NGOs forming, particularly in Guangdong. Many of the people that actually started these labor NGOs were former workers themselves. So we know about barefoot doctors. This was sort of like barefoot lawyers who were self-trained, who learned about this new labor law. And were actually encouraged for years, to a degree, to actually go out and teach workers about their rights. If there was a conflict between workers and management in a factory, in some cases, the local union, which has typically been very toothless and not very effective at all in China, actually sometimes would work in concert with these independent labor NGOs to try to solve the conflicts between the workers and the managers. So this was going on for a number of years. That really changed, honestly. It's very clear to see. We can trace very clearly where the shift happened, and it happened with shortly after Xi Jinping took power. And there was I think most of us know the dimensions of it. There was a sort of a whole-scale assault on civil society, on the rights lawyers, on feminists, on environmentalists to a degree, and very much on these labor NGOs. And one of the very sad things in reporting and in writing my book is the fact that these very idealistic people, these barefoot lawyers who created these organizations, many of them are now in jail. And there's been pretty much a complete decimation of this vibrant civil society that catered to workers' rights, that again was playing, at one point was seen by even the government as playing an effective role in trying to prevent labor unrest. If you can make the workers and the managers reach an agreement, then the workers don't have to go out and protest in the streets and block traffic.
And that's one of the threads in the book, is the fear on the part of government of these workers, these folks, if they were to organize, if they were to have horizontal linkages and to be able to reach from Dongguan to Shenzhen to Beijing. And you have the example of the students from Beijing joining labor protests down south and those kinds of things. The government is clearly quite concerned about that. And so managing this is very much a part of the stability management policy that the government has.
I think so, absolutely. And the Communist Party of China is no stranger in their history to labor movements, and utilize them, and worked with utilize the anger and the force of workers to, in part, to help them rise to power. And so they're very aware of the power of organized workers. And very sadly, for a very long time, before Xi Jinping as well, they have been very unfriendly, which is a great irony, to workers organizing. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is, even back in the 1950s, the then head of the All China Federation of Trade Unions, spoke out in support of striking workers that were striking in Shanghai then, and he lost his position and was basically purged because of that, because that's never been the role of the official union in China. It's never been the role to really represent workers in there, if there's any sense that it would change the status quo.
Very much a top-down control mechanism rather than a bottom-up, let's give voice mechanism.
It is. There's an interesting. So the party in China, when they actually created the official union, they borrowed this concept from Lenin, which is called the transmission belt. And the transmission belt is supposed to run between the workers and then all the way up to the top of the party. And on the one hand, the workers' concerns are supposed to rise up through the system, through the official union, to the party that then can respond to them. But it's also very much a transmission belt that works the other way, which is sending the dictates and the rules and the regulations and the ideas of the party down to the workers. And so this transmission belt is something that I believe Xi Jinping particularly has seen as key, and he also started a large-scale reform of the ACFTU, of the official union, not too many years ago, and other mass organizations as well. And part of it was to sort of reestablish this transmission belt function.
One of the things, and here we'll transition to questions from our audience. We've got some of your friends from Beijing chiming in as well. But we have Nathan Koka, who's asked a question about Xinjiang and public awareness outside of China of the detention camps and things like that. And Nathan Koka is tying that to the story that you tell about how consumer concerns, concerns outside of China, put pressure on multinational brands, Nike and others, to reform. And you highlighted in your presentation the Foxconn suicides, these kinds of things. One way Foxconn responded was by becoming the biggest purchaser of robots. But do you think that the greater awareness of the situation in Xinjiang will lead to the kind of pressure that will produce change? Now, this is not something you've written about. This is just something asking you to speculate based on your experience in looking at how companies respond.
Well, I certainly hope that it does. And I do know that companies now that have operations in China are becoming very aware of the potential risk of having part of their supply chain or one of their Chinese partners somehow involved in Xinjiang. So this is an issue that I know American companies, I've talked to them about it, they're saying, obviously, because hopefully it could bring about some change. Where I'm less optimistic is that in this case, the Chinese government and the Chinese party in particular, as the Chinese government, I don't think that they have any interest in trying to alter their policies in Xinjiang in response to this attention and this criticism that rightfully, this very appropriate criticism that they're getting from the rest of the world. And this is very different from what happened with the sweatshop movement in the US. When the sweatshop movement took off in the US, China had recently implemented the new labor law, and then 2 years later, a labor contract law, and they wanted those laws to be followed more within China. And they wanted the multinationals in particular, the big suppliers and the big retail brands to start to police themselves and to stop, for example, having workers not being paid properly for overtime or working excessive hours and in producing these goods for multinationals. This is not the case, of course, today with the Chinese government. They see, I'm sure they don't welcome, I'm sure, the attention and the criticism, but they have no intention of using that to implement new policies in Xinjiang. Much the opposite. I think what we're seeing today in China is an increasing sort of more and more this, you know, attitude like, we don't need you to lecture us anymore. We have our own way. It's more anger and figuring out ways to try to cover up what's happening there rather than actually trying to implement any real change. So not very.
Thank you. Les Ross, somebody who you've talked to, no doubt, quite a bit, he's raised a question specifically about leadership in Guizhou. And he's talking about the role where Chen Minar was promoting the development of the highest of high-tech industries in Guizhou province. But I was wondering if you could broaden your response to talk about the role of leadership. Your story is very much about the bottom, about how people are experiencing decisions made at the top, but we also see the role of individual agency. And you've highlighted in your presentation, in your answers to questions, and definitely in the book, the role of Xi Jinping. So can you talk specifically about the Guizhou leadership, but more generally about reformist leaders and things like that? Now you talk about Zhu Rongji and others in the book as well.
Well, I think they have an enormous impact. And in the case of Guizhou, those years when Chen Minar was the party secretary, I believe he went on to Chongqing at the last party congress. But before, when he was based there, was tremendously important for Guizhou to get attention. Being meant that Guizhou was able to, there was an enormous focus on it. So in the case of Guizhou, there was this decision to designate it as sort of a big data had all been vying for. But Guizhou, mainly through Chen Minar, was able to get, to sort of win that crown as the designated big data center. And that brought enormous money to Guizhou. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
It's coming in and out. And so your internet connection is not as stable. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So in the case, so this had an enormous impact on Guizhou, this connection between Chen Minar and Xi Jinping. And another official, Chen Gang, went on, I think he was the party secretary of Guiyang. He was then appointed the head of the Shong'an, Xi Jinping's new development, which we don't hear so much about anymore out in the Hebei marshes. But again, this just shows when the central government decides a place is important, their top officials, those people that are well connected, will be they'll be put in a place and they'll be able to bring in money there. The problem is when they move on, a place like Guizhou can sort of be forgotten. And I think that's happened to a degree with Chen Minar moving on to Chongqing and obviously back to Beijing. Typically, as you know, the senior leadership are supposed to rotate through the provinces. Mm-hmm. They're supposed to spend time in poor provinces and then eventually make it back to something important in Beijing. And by the way, people like that's something that we've seen in with Guizhou as well. Former finance minister, the former head of the China Construction Bank, all these people spent time, Guo spent time in Guizhou as well. So I do think it's very significant. I think with Premier Li Keqiang, we do see, I think, a frustrated individual, but someone who I would argue is a reformist at heart. I think he did his dissertation and his PhD on urbanization, and he's very concerned about how we deal with rural people in China. He comes from a very poor part of Anhui himself, not far from Shaogang, actually, from Shaogang, the birthplace of the household responsibility system and agricultural reform in China.
And actually, your story about going to Shaogang is fascinating because when you leave the model village, when you leave the birthplace of Chinese reform, you discover right next door the impact has been minimal.
Yeah, that trip was almost the timing was almost too perfect because I was there just sort of, I'd been meaning to go and I hadn't been before, and I was doing it for research for my book as well. So I went there and saw that, was sort of astonished to see how Shaogang had become a center for red tourism. Party officials had to go there and, look at this wonderful example. It's full of museums, the roads are well paved, the restaurants are expensive. But as you say, next door, you just step off into the neighboring village and there was poverty there. And Xi Jinping, as it turned out, showed up about a week later to go there and say, reform is good. And that was why he went to Shaogang. Of course, after that, we saw very little change in terms of the dual land policy.
Thank you, Tiff. Jonathan Liu asks a great question because the arc of your story, of course, coincides with the rise of the internet in China and the potential for migrant workers. You talk about migrant workers using their phones and these kinds of things to connect with each other, to maintain connections back home, these kinds of things. Do you have anything to say about how the internet has bypassed some of these people, or to what extent has it allowed for people to imagine a China that doesn't quite exist?
Well, the internet and mobile phones were a big part of sort of the growing labor movement, which alarmed the Chinese government. That was, an earlier chapter. That's basically, for now at least, been squelched by the officials. Now the internet is seen very much as this hoped-for way to enable more balanced development, including in rural China, and this idea that Taobao villages from Alibaba will be set up in the countryside, and the remoteness of these places will no longer be a problem because they will be able to use the internet to find buyers in the cities for the fine tea that they grow on the hills outside their village in Yunnan, or the mushrooms that they're growing in Guizhou, or whatever it might be. And this is something that Alibaba, JD.com as well, have very much made a priority to try to develop rural e-commerce. And I spent quite a bit of time looking at this as well. One way it has clearly benefited the interior is access to goods. So the goods are coming, and they're flowing from the cities into the countryside, and you don't need to have a nice store in your village that you might have had to have before the internet in order to get something good. And this is very important, and it improves lives, of course. What hasn't happened as quickly is the other direction. The products from the countryside, therefore, going out and being sold in the city and boosting the revenues of the farmers there. But this is something that they have put a big priority on. The former head of the World Bank talked about the Guizhou model and about how rural internet was changing people's lives. I'm a bit skeptical just because I spent quite a bit of time looking at it, and I saw some improvement, but these limits, for example, for the goods going the other way back into the cities, not really happening that quickly. The other interesting thing, to strike a more negative note, is as costs have gone up, and at the same time as officials continue to try to ensure that labor policies are followed, some of the more sort of sweatshop operations in China, a lot of them have left, but you do have a phenomena where there's smaller and smaller operations that sort of try to go under the radar, and they will not pay the workers the full wages, and the workers will work overtime. They'll find some workers that are willing to do that. They still exist in China. And I would argue that a lot of that you see now actually in Taobao villages, which often are started by former migrant workers, go back, set up a little factory in their village. The last thing they want to worry about is paying labor wages and so on. Now they can actually, the local officials are thankful that there's a little business there. The last thing they're going to do is tell them, are you for overtime, triple time for holidays, as the labor law requires them to do. So you've actually seen some unfortunate sort of sweatshop practices of the past come back as Taobao villages have spread. You've also seen more underage workers in rural China against the labor law being employed in factories.
And, some of those officials in the villages or in the townships, they may not be accustomed perhaps to having this, and very happy to have any sort of economic stimulus, as you said, and therefore not be worried about whether or not you are contributing to the social welfare fund as you should, whether or not you're paying those sorts of fair wages. Several people have asked questions about how you go about reporting in general, but specifically going out into the countryside and raising questions about how you found people to interview. Did the government intrude in any way? I would encourage these folks to read the book because one of the fascinating things that Tiff talks about is he's in people's living rooms. He's meeting them and discussing these kinds of things. But Tiff, could you say a little bit about what it's like to report from rural China?
Well, first of all, I find that people are amazingly hospitable, as is true often in the cities as well, but very striking in the countryside. And many of these places that I went, there would be no Jiao Dai Suo or little Binghuacun, little hotel to stay in. And as often as not, these people would say, "We have an extra bed upstairs, and please stay with us." And they would be offended to get in the car and go off to the township to find a hotel. So very, very hospitable people. And the issue with local officials, I think it's changing quickly in China, and it's becoming more and more difficult actually to travel without being monitored or potentially have local officials try to stop you from talking to people. Unfortunately, I think that's changing pretty quickly. My own experience was, and I mentioned some of this in the book, occasionally local officials would, in villages that I went to, would come up and say, "Who are you?" I always said, "I'm a journalist, and I'm an American," and I was perfectly honest with them. I often found that other villagers would sometimes intervene and say, we're getting to know this guy. He's please don't make him leave. We're just having a nice conversation about how we can develop our village and try to improve the lives of the people here. So that's sort of a general comment of what it was like to report in rural parts of China. It was very different reporting on the labor movement, particularly as the crackdown began. And in that case, also with issues, and I write about this in the book, in Chongqing, where there was and probably still is an enormous problem with local officials seizing land, and in sometimes violent situations where they hire local thugs to run the farmers off the land, and the ones that don't actually want to sell. So in those cases, it was a very different experience. I would be in interviews where the people would want to talk to me. They'd very much want to get their story out, but they would want to also make sure that, I was only in their living room for a certain amount of time, because any longer, and there might be, the door might be banged open, and there might be an issue with the local authorities.
Now, thank you. In your book, the biggest cleavage is rural-urban. For many Americans and for many people outside of China, there's greater attention to ethnic distinctions. Now, as it happens, you spend a lot of time in a minority village, and you're looking at members of ethnic minorities traveling and trying to find work throughout China. But that's one of the questions that one of your viewers here wants to talk about, is the issue of ethnicity, specifically for the Mo family, the entire village that consists of these Buyi villagers, that sort of thing. So if you could say something about the issue of language, because that's something that comes up, and these kinds of questions.
Yeah, well, one of the people I profile in the book and became a close friend of mine is a gentleman named Mo Ruchun. And the reason I met him was because when I was making my first visit to Binghuacun, his older brother, who happened to be an ambitious official, who's actually done quite well for himself and is now in Guangdong, and was helping me arrange the visit. He told his brother, who had been a migrant, was one of the earliest people to leave the village, specifically to come back to meet me. And the reason was, in Mo Ruchun's years as a migrant, as one of the earliest people to leave the village, he had picked up standard Mandarin. So he came back and we could speak to each other because he didn't just, like many of the older villagers, who couldn't speak standard Mandarin, it was a real challenge for me to actually speak to them in many cases. So that language was a big issue. The Mo's, who, as I mentioned, are all this Buyizu ethnic minority called the Buyi. They're very proud of their ethnic customs. They kept trying to get me to come back for their version of, they have their own Lunar New Year, which they call Xiaonian, little year. And it doesn't fall at exactly the same time as the Lunar New Year. And unfortunately, I didn't make it then. And I did make it to several Lunar New Years because that's when China was on holiday. And it was also a good time to go there because I knew that the migrant workers would come back, of course, usually. A large number of them would. And so it was a good chance to get back in touch with people that I knew that were working in different parts of China, whether mainly Guangxi and Guangdong. So, but what I found as I spent all these time talking to the Mo's was, despite the fact that they are very different in the fact that they are this ethnic minority, the issues and the challenges that they faced through the hukou policy, through the dual land system, are very much the same ones faced by Han migrants or migrants of other migrants from other minority backgrounds from across the country. And so that was sort of a common dilemma that they face still today, and shared with really all migrant workers in China.
Now, one of the questions that's come up comes from somebody who's familiar with Shanxi province. And this person is aware that there's been this urbanization boom. And of course, you talk about this, how China has gone from 20% urban to over 50%. And that has been China's main poverty alleviation program, is to move people to the cities and get them jobs where they get paid a little bit more than they were able to earn out in the countryside. And so in this instance, Heping Zhao asks, isn't that going to work? Why is hukou an issue if people can move to the city?
So, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind when you look at urbanization in China is what exactly are they referring to? And the leadership, to their credit, have talked repeatedly about trying to make sure that they do people-oriented urbanization. So what is what is urbanization without people? Well, this is actually very common in China. The cities grow, but the cities grow often by just redrawing city limits. So a place like Chongqing starts to redraw a lot of its rural areas with rural hukou as urban. And suddenly you have large numbers of new quote unquote urbanites, but who actually their lives have not changed. Simply the borders of the city have expanded. And Li Keqiang, who, as I mentioned earlier, has really focused on the urbanization question. He's been aware of this, and this trend of basically sort of false urbanization, or just basically making the cities larger, but not actually changing the lifestyles of the people. So that's one big thing. And by the way, of course, that really, there is the potential to benefit the people that were farmers that now suddenly are technically city residents. But that only deals with the people that are on the outskirts of the big cities. So they have the potential to become somehow more integrated. It doesn't always work that way, into the cities and become quote unquote urbanized. Is if you look at hukou reform in China, and if you talk to the government, there's been lots of hukou reform. But the reality is, a lot of it is directed at second or third tier cities. It's very much top down. It's the government deciding that this third tier city would really benefit from a lot more people. So we're going to actually open it up so that migrants can come here and have a shot at getting local hukou. And the first question is that where the migrants want to go? And typically that's not where they want to go. They've been very interested in, like everywhere in the world, going to some of the biggest, most vibrant cities, and places like Beijing, Shanghai, and a lot of different provincial capitals as well. Typically those places aren't terribly welcoming. In the case of China in recent years, they've been actively discouraging their migrant populations. Beijing and Shanghai have actually set negative population growth targets. So they've tried to reduce the number of people, and they've effectively reduced the number of people there. And how do they do that? They go through the apartment buildings, as they did after the big fire in the Daxing district of Beijing in 2018, and they say none of these buildings are up to code. And everyone living in them that happens to be migrants no longer can be in these apartment buildings. And they go to the private schools that cater to migrant children, and they do the same thing. They say this is a fire hazard, it doesn't have a proper licensing, and suddenly the migrant kids, the ones that have come with their parents to the cities, no longer have a place to go to school. And so I would argue that in many cities in China, we've seen the reversal of urbanization and the reversal of sort of hukou liberalization. Just one other thing I would say, many of the so-called hukou reforms are on point-based systems where you have to earn a certain amount of points in order to have a chance at getting local hukou. And these can be very onerous. And the migrants I spoke to, almost without exceptions, said, "This is absurd. I will never earn enough points according to this complicated point system in order to have a shot at getting the local hukou in the city." And some of the things they look at are whether you've bought property there, which is often very difficult for the migrants. They look at their education level. Many of them have very low education levels, unfortunately. And they look at how much they've paid, how many years they've paid into local taxes or contributed into the social welfare fund in these places. And in many cases, that's just not done. The workers haven't done it. Their managers have maybe actively discouraged it in order to cut costs. So it can be very, very difficult.
Yeah, Tiff, we've only got maybe 5 minutes left, and we have so very many questions here. One of the stories that you tell is the graying of the countryside, this aging society, and how the absence of an adequate healthcare system is one of the things that work, and that works against stimulating consumption because people want to save to deal with the possibility of having an injury or an illness, things like that. So you've talked in the book a lot about this. Now, one of the questions that one of the viewers has raised is why is this assumption of a rising middle class in China, a consumption boom that will benefit foreign producers as well as Chinese producers? Why are you labeling that as a myth?
So, I mean, if you look at what we've seen in the years until recently, there's been this tremendous growth in urban incomes mainly. And depending on how you count it, there are upwards of 200, 300 million people in the middle class. But the argument that I make, and one of the myths of my book, is that this growth will continue, and really needs to continue beyond the cities now. because most of it's been in the city so far. To a degree, we're seeing almost a level of saturation. You can see it if you're a multinational and you've been selling in the cities, whether you're an Apple, for example, that the growth levels so the growth levels that they experienced selling has come way down as the cities have sort of become saturated. The people there that can afford an iPhone have mainly bought an iPhone or have bought a good Chinese competitor. So now that really the next step is trying to extend this into the countryside. My argument again is because of these legacy policies, this is just not happening. Those people that are not part of the cities and don't have urban hukou are not going to magically become part of the middle class if they continue to be treated this way. Now, China could unleash tremendous new productivity. And productivity, by the way, in the economy has come way down, which is a huge challenge for the continued growth of the economy. They could end the hukou policy. They could reform the dual land system in the countryside and unleash a new wave of productivity to match what came with China's entry to the WTO, to match what came with the movement of rural workers into factories. But the signs so far are that this is not happening. And until they do that, we're going to, then I still argue that there is this myth that we're going to see a continuously expanding middle class.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Tiff, you've been based in Montana. Right now, you're a fellow at the Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana, and writing this book, drawing on interviews that you conducted over decades. So you've been busy with that. But we've had several people raise the question of COVID-19. And so asking you to wear your business analyst hat, your social analyst hat, your political analyst hat, to look at what the impact has been in China and the long-term, near and medium long-term impact of the disease, the economic shutdown, and the difficulty of now China doesn't have anybody to sell to because we're all staying at home.
Yeah, I think that's first of all a huge challenge for China going forward, even as the economy starts to recover to a degree in Chinese cities. And I found this very interesting example where Apple announced a couple of weeks ago that they were shutting their retail shops globally, except in Greater China, where they were reopening them in the mainland. And I don't know how many they had shut in Taiwan and Hong Kong, but that was the one part of the world where Apple retail shops would be open. And so, but what's going to happen going forward? Yeah, I think there's going to be a tremendous impact on the externally oriented part of the Chinese economy. I think no one in the world is going to be buying many Chinese exports later this year, as we lock down our economies here and everywhere else. This has, to a degree, been, I think, a reminder to the Chinese leadership of the importance to try to push this transition to a more domestic consumption-driven economy. And before that, the two-year trade war, which had an impact on the Chinese economy as well, was a real wake-up call for the Chinese leadership to push more quickly to try to have an economy that was reliant on the spending power of its own people. So I think they're aware that this is what they need to do. So far, I don't think it's happening at all. The early signs of the COVID-19 impact show an inordinate impact on the countryside. So Scott Rozelle at Stanford just came out with an interesting survey that shows that migrant workers who basically, some of them have made it back, many of them have not, have already lost about $1 billion in income, according to surveys they did. In many cases, they can't get back to their jobs. This is true. It's been true in manufacturing. More of them have made it back for manufacturing. It's really true in the service economy, which is now the biggest employer of migrants. Many of those places are simply just not opening now, or they're opening with a far, far smaller staff than before. And my fear as well is that some of these sort of, I would call prejudices or fears about migrants in China are only going to be intensified because of COVID-19. There are a lot of reports about cities, neighborhoods and cities now that have shut their doors and are trying to block migrants from coming back into apartments that they rented. In some cases, very heavy-handed things like shutting off the water and electricity so that the migrants can't stay there any longer. I think we all know now that most housing estates in the cities right now, they have a very complicated and system where to restrict who can go in and out. And this is you can understand why they're afraid that the COVID-19 will come back. But I'm afraid that this is sort of, if anything, is going to strengthen the sort of anti-rural bent that I think has been very strong in China for decades now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This will be the very last question, and I'll ask you to have a short answer to it. Since you've been back here in the United States and you're staying in touch with friends and colleagues via WeChat and other mechanisms, but you're also consuming a lot of American coverage. Do you recognize the China that people are talking about?
A lot of the time I don't, and I've been doing quite a bit of media myself, which has been a real illuminating for me. Everything from Fox News Radio to NPR, and so no. To answer your question, I think there's some very large misconceptions about the country of China here in the United States, and I'm afraid it's getting it's becoming even more skewed from reality right now. We've seen a shift, sort of a very unfortunate shift towards more negative attitudes towards China, including towards Asian people in general. Terrible, issues of racism coming up again as well. So, I'm concerned about that. I do think that for those of us that have focused our lives on China, this is a good opportunity to try to at least share a little bit what we know about the country, and hopefully counter some of the more misguided ideas that are out there and seem to be growing today in the U.S.
Thank you so much, Tiff. And I really want to invite you. I hope we can get you out to USC once we're allowed to have in-person contact again. And so we're looking forward to bringing you out and having you participate in still more conversations. I want to encourage people to get this book. Tiff's point here at the end about the China he knows not being always in evidence in media discussions, he addresses this. His book humanizes what's going on in China, what has gone on, and you get a much richer sense of the problems, the dynamism of the place and the people. So I really want to encourage people to get this book. Tiff mentioned one of the U.S.-China Institute's good friends, Scott Rozelle. Scott's research is in the book, looking at questions of nutrition and rural education, these kinds of things. There is so much that even in an hour and a half, we can't touch upon. So please take an opportunity to get this book. And Tiff, thank you so much. Ordinarily, we'd be offering you the U.S.-China Institute mug as a gesture of thanks, but we can't do that now. Ladies and gentlemen, my colleague Craig Stubing has just put up a poll, and we hope that you will respond to that poll. We hope that you will tell other people about the Institute, about the great programs that we have, such as the one today. We look forward to connecting with you again. We look forward to hearing from you. Please contact us via Facebook, via Twitter, via the U.S.-China Institute email account. We welcome it all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. Please complete the poll, and wherever you are, feel free to applaud, because Tiff Roberts and this wonderful book deserve it.
Thank you so much, Clay. I look forward to visiting USC. I really actually am planning to do that. I'll take you up on that going forward when we can travel again.
Can't wait to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.